So to get this conversation started, we're going to talk about stress as a normal experience first. So most of us have some sort of experience with stress. We're going to talk about what stress is, but it's really important to understand that stress is a normal part of life. There is no human experience that does not involve stress. And unfortunately, stress isn't going away. We'll talk about a little bit about why, but at some point, we have to learn to deal with stress in our day-to-day lives. So it is universal. You know, if people tell you that they're not stressed, I'm questioning that. They may not understand stress and how it manifests, but for the most part, stress is a normal, universal experience in the human condition. So, eventually we're going to be talking about managing stress and building resiliency, but right off the bat it's important to understand that how stress manifests with us, how we manage it, and then how we build resiliency is often very unique for each of us. And the other thing about managing stress and turning that into sort of building resiliency is it's a lot harder than a lot of people think it is. So as we go through this today, just be thinking initially, what are some of the challenges that you have in your life related to stress and how you manage it? So, continuing on, the most basic question, what is stress? When you think of stress, what do you think of? According to the World Health Organization, stress is a state of worry or mental tension caused by a difficult situation. It's a natural human response that prompts us to address challenges and threats in our lives, and it affects both the mind and the body. And you know, that's about as good of a definition as you can get. I'm going to split stress up into 4 big components. It's just a way that I think about stress that, in my opinion, makes it easier for you to understand how it's impacting you. So first, there's the physiological component of stress, and this impacts our sleep, digestion, respiration, our cardiovascular system. There's the psychological component, often associated with worry, what ifs, rumination, catastrophizing. There's the social component. Stress often manifests socially in our lives through difficulty in our relationships. And then the last component that we'll talk about today is the existential component. So what's going to happen to my career, my job, my family, and other aspects of that existential experience. To begin with, the physiological component. There's an older model of the brain that is not exactly perfect, but it's a really good way to understand the foundations of stress. And this model is called the triune brain, and it splits the brain up into 3 different sections. One is the brain stem at the base of the brain. This is attributed to a lot of unconscious physiological processes such as respiration. And on top of that is the limbic system. This is associated with our emotional experience, our emotional part of the brain. The most common and well-known attributes of this part of the brain is our fight or flight responses. And then our cortex, which sits on top of the brain, and this is our thinker. It is our logical part of the brain. It's where all of those what ifs come from. It's important to understand that because stress comes from different aspects of the brain, and whenever there's different parts of stress from different parts of the brain, we need to address them differently. Another important concept in understanding the way that stress impacts us is polyvagal theory. It's a very complicated theory, but think of it as a theory that explains how our brain is connected to different parts of our body. So our vagus nerves exit the bottom of the brain and really infiltrate our body in so many different ways, including our stomach, our intestines. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of times when we experience stress, we have stomach issues. There's other biochemical aspects, so neurotransmitters and hormones like testosterone and cortisol. These hormones are triggered and a lot of times by stressful situations. And then there's physical or bodily components of stress, such as issues with our muscles and tension. You know, I think all of us has experienced tense muscles before whenever we're stressed. Also in pain. Really interesting research out there. People who suffer from depression actually experience pain more intensely. And then there's a complex notion called allostatic load. But it is important to mention because essentially what allostatic load is the way that chronic stress impacts the body. And it impacts our endocrine system, it impacts things like our body's natural weight management system, and it's just a really important part of understanding how stress impacts us on that biological or physiological level. So, it is important to call out right from the very beginning, not all stress is bad. And there is a really useful infographic of a bell curve. And in it, it shows that too little stress can often make you too laid back, make you inactive. And then as you go up the curve, there is sort of this optimal stress where you're motivated and you have this desire to perform, but it's not so much that you become exhausted or that you feel overloaded. And as the stress curve kind of goes over the hump of that optimal stress into being exhausted or too much stress, it really can create problems. And once you get on the downward slope of the curve, a lot of times that's whenever we experience things like anxiety or panic or anger or fear, and eventually can lead to feeling burnt out and experiencing a breakdown. Another really important infographic in understanding stress is, and it'll be on the screen, but essentially we have a stressor, and then there is our reaction to stress. And that reaction is going to be physiological, like I mentioned just a little bit ago, and it's going to be psychological, like I'm fixing to explain. And there's wear and tear on our body, on our organ systems, and that reduces our optimal health, which actually makes us more sensitive to stress. And then, because life is always going, it's always moving forward, when you know it, we come upon more stressors. And so then it's just this vicious cycle of our reaction to stress wearing down our bodily systems, reducing our optimal health, and then becoming more sensitive to stress. This is one of the reasons why if we don't develop a good stress management practice or a good resiliency practice in our lives, stressors tend to accumulate, and they really do tend to just snowball into really big problems that manifest in a lot of problematic ways for us. So, moving on to the psychological component of stress. I like to split this in between thoughts and emotions, mood, or feelings, even though that's not 100% accurate. It's a useful way to think of it. So that psychological component of stress can manifest in our thoughts, right? So think about the what ifs, the ruminations. You know, how many times have something unexpected happen and then we spend an hour stressing about the what ifs rather than focusing on just what happened. There's all sorts of problematic thought processes that our mind engages in, jumping to conclusions, black and white thinking, mental filtering, or what we call disqualifying the positive, where once a stressful thing happens, for some reason, all we can recall are all bad things. We forget all about the good aspects of our life. These are called cognitive distortions, and they often may not cause stress, but actually exacerbate that psychological experience of stress. And then there's a separate issue that I like to talk about, and that's a story, right? So very quickly, a what if can turn into a grand story or narrative that you get caught up in, and before you know it, you're believing in that story rather than just acknowledging the stressful experience that happened. And this has a really profound effect on us being able to manage that psychological component of the stress. Because if we get so caught up in this story about what happened, rather than just focusing on what actually happened, a lot of times we waste a lot of psychological and frankly physiological resources in trying to deal with something that might not really be associated with what's causing the stress in the first place. The other part of the psychological component is our emotions. I kind of lump emotions, feelings, and mood all together. So there's a really good visualization that is a wheel. It's called the feeling wheel, and it has dozens and dozens and dozens of different emotions on it. A lot of times people like to distill our emotional experiences down to just half a dozen or so basic emotions. But I find that that's an oversimplification, because in our day-to-day life, the truth is, we feel scared differently than we feel terrified. Similarly, we feel mad different than we feel livid as a feeling, right? So I do think it's important to split those emotions up and to recognize them as separate. Now, as the stress levels increase, that psychological component becomes larger. A lot of times we feel uncomfortable feelings. We get into bad moods. We have what we might call negative or bad emotions. And these things really can, once again, exacerbate those stressors that we have in our lives. Now, sometimes it is useful to separate what emotions, feelings, and mood is or are, and that can be useful. But for the most part, I utilize emotions and feelings interchangeably. Not that that's 100% accurate, but it's just easier to talk about and to relate to folks. Mood, however, is a little different. Mood is a more persistent state. Right, so I might feel really joyous after hearing a funny joke, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm in a really good mood, right? So it is important and can be useful to differentiate those things. All right, so on to the third component of stress. I split stress into 4 components for the ease of talking, but also because as we're managing stress, we need to address each issue. And this third component, the social component, is often one of the main ways that stress really becomes problematic in our lives. So stress manifests socially in a lot of ways. Unfortunately, a lot of us either withdraw and seclude ourselves and become isolated, or we lash out and become agitated. And for obvious reasons, these things can have really negative impacts on our relationships, whether they're personal relationships, familial relationships, or work relationships. So it's really important to recognize how stress is impacting us socially. Now, the way it does that is often through various defensive processes. So you see sometimes blaming, sometimes we experience something and it really stresses us out and we just want to blame other people in our life, regardless of whether or not the fault really lies with them. And in a lot of ways, it just makes our maintaining healthy relationships difficult. Another common example is displacement. And so the classic example there is, your boss makes you mad at work, but you can't kick your boss, so you come home and kick the dog, right? Unfortunately, a lot of times displacement occurs and it becomes really problematic in our relationships, both personally and professionally. All right, the last component of stress I want to talk to you today is the existential component. And, I add this component in because I think it's overlooked a lot of times by people in general, but especially mental health professionals. Humans are innately spiritual. Now that spirituality looks different in different cultures and in different settings, but a part of that, it often comes with purpose, with, why am I here? And so stress can manifest existentially in our lives by really causing us to question our purpose. Sometimes it's our purpose in existence, sometimes it's purpose in our career, sometimes it's purpose in our family and the roles that we have to play. Sometimes we might ask ourselves, what is the point? What's the point of not just doing X, Y, or Z, but even existing, especially if our stress is really getting out of control? And a lot of times this causes issues in our spiritual lives. It can cause ambivalence or spiritual ambiguity, which can be really dangerous because oftentimes for many people, those spiritual resources are a really important part of their support system and their general resources throughout their lives. And those are 4 components of stress. And how they manifest in us. The next video in this series, we're going to be talking about, okay, now that we understand what stress is, how it might manifest, how do we manage it? So our next video will be focused on what do we do about this stress and how do we manage it in the different areas of our lives. Thank you.